Hey guys, welcome back. Today I thought it would be a really good day to do a review of all the Baker Creek green bean varieties that I grew this year. So this year I grew 7 different varieties of beans in my garden. We have about 1/3 of an acre. I live here in town. And this is my 2nd year gardening. I really wanted to get into growing things that I knew I would use and that would preserve well over the winter, whether I decided to can or freeze them. So I really focused on growing things that I knew that I would want to use. I didn't have a good idea of what kind of green beans to grow. So I loved watching seed reviews and videos that showed all the different kinds of plants and seeds and learning about the different kinds. And so I just couldn't pick. So I bought 7 packets, bought 7 different kinds of seeds. And I grew them all in my little garden, and it's now the beginning of August. So I thought that it's been long enough and I've got a pretty good idea of what's growing well, what I like, what I don't like, and what I will grow next year. Also what I won't grow next year. So I wanted to share that with you all. I'm going to be discussing 5 factors that plays into my decision on what I want to grow next year and what I don't. So the number one thing that I'm looking for when I decide what I want to grow next year is production. So how much food can I get in a certain amount of space, whether I grow 1 row or 2 rows of this kind of green bean. The second thing that I'm looking for is appearance. So not only is it a cool variety, or not only is it interesting to look at or pretty to grow, but is it easy to see when I'm actually harvesting them. So I like to be able to go out, especially if I don't have a lot of time, and be able to look through the plants and be able to see them quickly. And then it also makes it easier not to miss them. The number 3 thing that I look for is disease and pest resistance. I don't use any chemicals on my plants, so I wanted to make sure whatever I grew could outlast the bugs and any other issues that came. The number 4 thing I'm looking for is texture. Some varieties have a really big string in them, and if they grow too long, then that string gets really thick and can make it difficult to eat. Number 5 thing I added is how forgiving is it? I don't have time to go out every single day and pick beans and put them up. I just don't have time for that. So there are times that I'm able to make it outside every day, but there are times that it's 2, 3, or 4 days before I can get out and harvest these. So some of these varieties that I've grown have been really forgiving, and I can come out every couple of days and the beans are just fine. But some of them have really small windows of when you can harvest them, and they end up getting too big. So I'm going to show you all 7 varieties today. I'm going to show you examples of them when they are at a good time to harvest, and what happens, a couple days later if I don't get out there to harvest them, that you guys can plan your garden for next year and think about what kind of seeds you want to get and what kind of things that you want to grow in your garden. The first bean I'm going to talk about is the Rattlesnake pole bean. I've showed this on my garden tours. I've liked this one more than I thought I would for a couple of other reasons, but I'll go ahead and go through the list of all the 5 factors that is going to determine whether I grow it next year or not. Number 1 was production. I grew these on a trellis because they are a pole bean. From what I learned when I did my research is that pole beans are a little bit higher of a producer than bush beans. I did not find this to be the case with this variety though, where I grew it in my garden and the methods that I use, so it may be different for you if you decide to grow this in your garden. But I've not gotten a lot out of them. The plants had a hard time getting started, and they haven't even reached the top of my trellis yet, and it's the beginning of August. So I wasn't wowed by how they grew. Now, I'm starting to get more beans now later in the season than I did, a couple of weeks ago, which has made me think that I like them a little bit better. Yeah, they just haven't produced a lot. So for production, I'm not going to rate them very high. For appearance, I do think that they are really beautiful. If you can see, they're green with purple stripes. Some of them look like this, where they're striped pretty uniformly, and some of them look like this, which is kind of neat. They still have the same coloration, but it's a different pattern. So I think that's pretty cool. They're easy to spot on the trellis because of their spots. So I did like them for that reason. For disease and pest resistance, I would say they've been okay. See, I didn't get very many plants that actually made it up the trellis. I would say probably pretty average on disease and pest resistance. Texture-wise, I really liked them. They don't get stringy very fast. And number 5, for forgiveness, they are very forgiving. If it's been 3 or 4 days or even close to a week, I've come out and they've still been very tender, and beans don't get too big and they don't get too stringy. They'll show you here the difference on when you harvest them versus when they get too big. These here you can see this one's on the smaller side, but I would still harvest this one to put up because it's a pretty good size, but I say this is about the right size that you want to pick them. They still snap really easy. They don't have a string that comes off of them when you snap them, and they have a really good taste. Now when they get too big, they look like this, and then you can start to see the beans in them. This is not when I like to harvest my green beans. I did this last year because I thought, well, the bigger the better, but they don't. The beans are really big on the inside, and they have this really thick string that when you process them, you either have to pull off or just kind of deal with when you eat them. So that's not really something I'm interested in doing, so I like to catch them a little bit smaller. And they even get to where the outside gets really fibrous and hard to eat. And see, like I can't even hardly snap this one because it's so stringy. See? Oh. And number 2 on my list is dragon tongue bush beans. Now, as far as production, they've been very productive. They've been one of the highest producing beans in my garden. So I give them credit for that. I would say appearance wise, they're the prettiest bean that I grow. They have a really pretty color, really pretty markings on them. They're really similar in appearance to the rattlesnake pole beans, but they're just a little bit lighter, more of like a yellow, and then the purple is a little bit more prominent. And they've been really good about disease resistance and pest resistance. I would say probably pretty average. And I think I'll mark texture and forgiveness in the same category for these. They are best harvested when they're about this size, or even closer to this size. Is getting a little bit too big. But the difference between this bean and this bean is probably only about a day. They grow so fast that it's hard to get to them before they get too big to eat. So I picked this one here that had gotten forgotten. See how big this has gotten. This is just enormous, and it really only takes a day or 2 for them to get this size. So for somebody that harvests their green beans every single day, that's not a problem. But what I found is that I'm not out there often enough to be able to catch them before they get inedible, which is about this size. They still snap pretty good when they're this medium size. Just a little fibrous, but not bad. Probably would be fine, you know, in a slow cooker. Not real stringy, so it's pretty good. But this one here, like this one's not good for cooking just like a traditional green bean. And really it's only good for saving seeds at this point. But I just picked it to show you guys. See, I can get the beans out of them. So I put up a few bags of these beans, but I haven't been super impressed with how often I have to go out and pick these. Next on the list is golden butterwax. These are a yellow bean. As far as production goes, they've been very prolific. Every day I go out and harvest these, I get several handfuls, if not, you know, a small bucket full. I like them appearance wise because they're yellow and they're really easy to see, and it's harder to miss them when you go out to harvest them. Disease and pest resistance wise, they've done really, really well. When some of my plants are dying off, they still look pretty healthy. Texture wise, I give them an A+. And as far as forgiveness goes, they have very thin strings, if they have strings at all. This size is about perfect to be able to harvest them. So when I snap them, they just have this tiny little string, but it's not very thick, so it breaks off really easily, and they freeze really well. So even when they get this big, which is probably after about 3 or 4 days, they still snap really well. They have a string, but it's still really small. If it bothers you, you could try to peel it out. But I've noticed that even when they're a little bit bigger like this, they still do just fine. So these are very forgiving beans. Next bean on my list is a pole bean, and it's called Greasy Grit. This is the one that in my videos that I thought was a bush bean, but ended up it was a pole bean, so I had to adjust a few things, but which is fine. Overall, with the production of these have been my highest producing bean. They have just grown like crazy. They've produced twice as many beans as any of my other varieties have. And I think if I went out there more often, if I went out there every day, I would get a whole lot more. As far as the appearance goes, they are green, so they're harder to see, they're easier to miss. I do like the way that they grow. They grow in bunches on the vine, so it is easier to just, once you do see them, you can just pick a handful of them, rather instead of like on a bush bean, you just kind of pick one at a time. So I feel like harvesting goes a little bit faster with these. Disease and pest resistance, they've not done great with that. Japanese beetles really love them, and they have really done quite a bit of damage to them. However, the plants still are fairly healthy, and it doesn't seem to bother them too much. I'd say overall it's okay with disease and pest resistance. As far as texture goes and forgiveness, I would probably put this lowest on my list for the simple fact that they grow so fast, which is a good thing. But I'm not able to get out there quick enough to where I can pick them before they are too fibrous or too big to eat. And I like to harvest these when they're about this size, so they're super tiny, but they don't have that big string that some of the bigger ones have. You can see when I snap this one, it even still has a little bit of a string on it, but it's not bad. So I would eat them at this size, but these are just so tiny, it's almost not even worth it. This is just probably 2 days later, so look at the difference. These almost look like peas with how big the pods get. So these may be good for saving seeds, and I'm gonna do some more research about saving dry beans and how to use dry beans and store them and that kind of thing. I don't think it'll be really difficult, but I just don't know anything about it. So I think if you were into that kind of thing, these might be your best bet, because they have a lot of good sized beans inside them, but these are just not good for eating traditional green beans we would think of them. So to snap them off, you can tell right away that that bean is really large and it's really hard, and it has a really big string when it comes off. And that string goes all the way down, and compared to some of these other varieties I've grown, I just prefer the ones without the string. Okay, so the next bean on the list is called Contender. They are more of a traditional shaped green bean. So as far as production, they've done okay. They were my first to produce, so I thought that was very interesting. They've just done, I would say, average as far as production goes. Appearance wise, of course, they're green just like the plant, so they're not hard to see, but they don't stand out, so I do miss some occasionally. And if I had a lot more plants than I do now, I would definitely miss a lot more than I do. Disease and pest resistance, they've done fairly well. They're still looking really healthy, even though the weeds are starting to come up and the bugs are getting bad. They still look fairly healthy. As far as texture and forgiveness goes, they do okay. They do get a little bit bigger than when they get forgotten about. These two, about as big as they get. I haven't seen any get too much bigger than this. These were forgotten about at least one time. But when you snap them, they still snap really well. They don't have a really thick string in them, and they preserve really well, even when they get a little bit too big. Overall, these were a pretty good one to grow. Okay, bean number 6 is one that really surprised me. This one is called Kalima. Overall, it's been a really, really good one. As far as production goes, it's been one of my most productive and prolific beans. Appearance wise, so this is what they look like. They're very thin and green. So I have noticed that I miss them a lot because I think they look like the stems of the plant until they get a little bit bigger. As far as disease and pest resistance goes, they've done really well. They're still really healthy and giving me a lot of beans. Texture and forgiveness, these are my most forgiving bean. So I can come out on a Monday and harvest as many as I can, and then I could come out probably 4 or 5 days later and they will only be this big. So even if I wait until they're about this size to harvest, which I think is just about right, they still snap really well. They don't have a big string, and they're really long. So I can usually get like 3, I can usually get 3 or 4 pieces out of each bean. So I've been really happy with these. So my last bean is the Chinese noodle bean, also called Asian long bean or yard long bean. These are the ones that grow from my trellis. They're really long and red. They generally grow to be about 18 inches long. Production wise, they are going crazy. I'm getting so many. I've only have 1 trellis of them. I'm getting tons of beans, more than I can eat, but I've been really happy with the production. They've been my most productive bean for sure. As far as appearance goes, they're really easy to see, obviously, because they hang from the trellis and they don't look like anything else around them, so you can't miss them. So that's really good. They're just really easy to pick. You don't have to bend over to pick them because they're on a trellis, which is one of the good things about pole beans. Disease and pest resistance, they're by far my healthiest bean plant. So they're really, really good with that. No issues with disease or pest resistance. As far as texture and forgiveness goes, they are just a different texture. I haven't decided if I really love them or not, to be honest. I've made them in a stir fry and they were good. I've cooked them in a crock pot with potatoes and bacon and they were good. So I like them just fine. I think I would like to try to cook them a couple more times before I had a really good opinion on them as far as that goes. I'd say they're definitely worth growing for sure. And as far as forgiveness goes, they do stay at this tender stage a little bit longer than some of the other varieties. This is what they look like if you let them go a little bit longer. They get to where the beans inside get really hard and then the outside starts to dry out really easily. So again, I'm gonna do some more research on saving beans and using dry beans. If I decide this is something I want to do, I would say this is a really good variety to do that with because they're so long. You can get a lot of beans out of 1 pod, and I probably have 50 to 100 of these on my trellis right now. They grow really fast and they produce a lot of beans. So that may be something that I do in the future. I may grow them for that reason in the future and not for eating fresh. But I'll just have to do some research and some trial and error and decide if that's something that I want to do. So guys, that's my review of these Baker Creek green beans. I am definitely not going to grow as many beans next year as I did this year for 2 reasons. Next year we're going to be moving, and so I'm not sure what my garden's going to look like next year. I still want to have a little bit of a garden, but we'll just kind of have to see how that timeline plays out. But 7 varieties is a lot, and doing this has been really good because it's really helped me to see which ones that I want to focus on. I for sure am going to grow golden butter wax and the Kalima beans next year. I really liked them. They're really good. They have good texture. They're really forgiving. I really like those a lot. As far as pole beans go, I'm for sure going to do the Chinese noodle beans again. They grew so well and they've been so beautiful. They've covered my trellises really early and they just really made the garden look really, really beautiful. So I was really impressed with those. The Rattlesnake pole beans have done fine. It could have been something to where I didn't plant them to where my soil wasn't very good when I planted them, and that could have been one of the biggest factors where I didn't get a whole lot of production. But overall, for a pole bean, I really like the texture. They are really pretty, easy to see, and easy to process. I probably will not grow Greasy Grit next year. They just were too quick to turn, too big to eat. Probably won't grow the dragon tongue bush beans again, even though they're really pretty and they have good flavor. It just takes no time for them to become inedible and get too big. And then the contender beans were fine. I feel like those were just a regular bean. Those did fine for me. So it's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on the time of year that we actually end up getting out there, how much time I have to actually put into my garden out at our new property next year. So it'll depend on a few things, but those are my top few varieties that I grew out here. So I hope that helps you with choosing your seeds for next year. And I hope that you're able to grow food for yourself, food for your family, and create a beautiful garden that you can spend time in. So thanks for joining me today, guys. Until next time.